Hi there! In this video today I'm going to be talking about the struggles of having a food dye sensitivity. Now, food dye sensitivity is something that can happen when you consume food dyes and it triggers issues such as physical issues, neurological issues, or psychiatric/mental issues, and it can affect people with conditions such as ADHD and Tourette syndrome and PANS. I've known lots of people in the Tourette community and some people in the PANS community who react extremely badly to food dyes. My food dye sensitivity was detected when I was 3 years old by my parents, and for me the main things that my food dye sensitivity triggers are rage attacks and crying a lot and panic. So the first struggle of having food dye sensitivity is that you have to read the ingredients on pretty much everything, so you're there in the shop just reading the labels and everything for ages, and that's pretty much the same for anyone with any food sensitivity, but it can be quite time consuming. Shopping takes a lot longer that way, but it is worth it to avoid the food dyes which trigger horrible reactions. Number two, the second thing is that it can be really challenging when family members don't take your food dye sensitivity seriously. In the past I had extended family members who would try to feed me food dyes to prove that it wouldn't affect me, but every single time I would go home and have a reaction. So, you know, my parents knew that I was having food dyes. Wow! But yeah, it is sad when people try and prove that you don't have something like that. It's very annoying, because some people think that the concept of food dye sensitivity is ridiculous when it's not, because there are countless studies showing that food dyes can trigger reactions in sensitive individuals. I will link some stuff down below where you can find out information on that. But if people say that they have a food dye sensitivity, then you need to follow that. Don't purposefully give them things that they've said can cause a reaction, or that their parents have said can cause a reaction. Number three, one big challenge is trying to explain to pharmacists why you need a food dye free version of the medication, a food dye free version of your prescription. When I had antibiotics for an infection, one of my parents had to try and explain to the pharmacist why I need an antibiotic without food dyes in. And sometimes it can take a little bit of arguing, because they don't really understand the severity of a food dye sensitivity. They don't understand why it is so serious if you consume some food dyes, but the rage attacks it can trigger can be incredibly violent and can cause injuries to myself or someone else. So it is extremely important that I don't have it. It's honestly the worst feeling in the world when I consume food dyes. So it can take a while to explain to pharmacists why you need an antibiotic or medication without food dyes in, but it is fully worth it. And when I was under CAMS, my psychiatrist had to write a specific brand of medication on my prescription so that I could get the brand without food dyes in. So for medications, there's one type of medication, I had risperidone, but there were different brands of the risperidone. Some of the brands of risperidone triggered horrific reactions for me because they had food dyes in, and some were absolutely fine because they didn't have the food dyes in. So they would have to write the version without food dyes in on the prescription. And sometimes it didn't even work out that well, because there were still arguments, because the pharmacists will say, well, this brand's more expensive. But if it's the only thing that really works and the other ones cause horrible reactions, honestly it's a waking nightmare, then, you know, it is important that a person gets the correct one. I'm putting my sunglasses on because the bright lights in my room are bothering me. I usually have my light dimmed because I have an adjustable light, but I turned it up to film this video so you can see me, but now I'm wearing these because the bright light is bothering me. I must also say that if you see, this sounds really weird, if you see penis drawings reflected off of my glasses, it's because I am sitting in front of a wall that my tics have drawn penises on, copographia. So if you see that reflected in my glasses, that's what that is, ignore that. Wow! Another challenge of having a food dye sensitivity is that it can be difficult to get it into your doctor's notes. I was in the ER for something, nothing serious, just getting tests, and they asked if I have any allergies, and I don't have allergies as such, but I have food sensitivities. So I told them I'm sensitive to dairy and food dyes, and they wrote the dairy one down, but they completely left out the food dye one, even though I said it multiple times. Yeah, it's not good. They don't necessarily take it as seriously. People think that if you say food dyes, they're like, oh, that's silly, oh, it mustn't be serious, but it is. And the reason I want it in my doctor's notes is because if I'm ever in hospital overnight, which I hope I never would be, but if I was, then what if they would give me something with food dyes in and I'd have a rage attack? I'd smash the whole place up and just be in extreme distress, and Even worse, hopefully this will never happen either, you can see that my mind goes to weird places. So even worse would be, imagine if I was in a psychiatric ward, which hopefully never happens, but imagine if that happened and they gave me food dyes because they weren't taking my sensitivity seriously. I'd never be able to get out of the bloody ward because they would be triggering responses, rage attacks and psychiatric issues from the consumption of food dyes, and that's why I was trying to get it into my doctor's notes when they were asking. But unfortunately, they don't always see it as something that's necessary or serious, even though it is. Another challenge of having a food dye sensitivity is people asking if you eat rabbit food. Someone asked this to me when I was in secondary school when I told them I couldn't eat food dyes. I do not eat rabbit food, although, okay, maybe now I do, I'm vegan, but then I wasn't eating rabbit food. Strangely though, food dyes are in a lot of things you wouldn't expect, not just in sweets, not just in cakes and stuff, but they're actually in a lot of different things like sauces, crisps, cheeses, lots of different things. So I kind of understand why they said that, because there are tons of things with food dyes in, but there were still plenty of things I could eat then that didn't have food dyes in. The next challenge is residential school trips. When you go on a school trip that's overnight, of course you have to write down food allergies, food sensitivities, because hey, they need to be able to give you food that's suitable and isn't going to cause problems. So my parents had to write my food dyes that I couldn't have onto the form, and the teacher called me out of class before we were going on the trip to talk about it. Hey! They were asking me about my food dye sensitivity and asked what actually happens if you eat these things, because I think they're probably just quite curious and wondering why they would have to make sure I adhere to this sort of diet. Hey, and I would say to them, it triggers rage attacks, it makes me very violent and angry, and that was probably quite confusing to them because they never saw me having a rage attack. I'd never had them in school, and I never had them at that time because I was free from food dyes. So wow, they probably thought that was a bit weird. Another challenge of having a food dye sensitivity is being wary about eating outside of the house, because if you're at a cafe or something, you may not know what's in the foods. Hey! And as I said, food dyes can be in many different things, like cheeses and meals and anything really. Not everything, but there are a lot of things, like mushy peas have food dyes in, and I didn't even know that before I'd read the ingredients on it. Thankfully I hadn't eaten it before then. But what I'm trying to say is food dyes are in so many things, and sometimes you'll be out at a cafe eating a meal and you'd have no clue that there's food dyes in it because you wouldn't expect it, but sometimes it does, and sometimes that can trigger problems. So you get very wary about eating out when you have a food dye sensitivity or any sort of food sensitivity. Another challenge is when you've eaten something that has food dyes in, or that you don't know if it has food dyes in, and now you're worrying about it. That can be terrifying. So, okay, there's one thing that happened. This is quite a funny story. In secondary school, hey, I had some pasta from the school canteen. And most of the pasta was normal, but some of it was green. And then I completely freaked out because now I know it's green because that, I don't know, it's not food dye, but it's just naturally like that. But I didn't know that at the time. Yay! I thought I had green food dye in, and I'd completely freaked out. I went and I was just crying. I was just crying at lunchtime, and then went to the next class. I was still crying, and no, the teachers didn't ask anything. And like some of the teachers, when I was crying, they would just completely ignore it. Anger. But I was just completely freaked out because I was terrified that I would react to the tiny bit of green pasta I ate. It was that bad because I never want to have a rage attack again, and I never want to have the feeling of what it's like to eat food dyes again. So I was terrified. Thankfully it didn't actually contain food dyes, it was naturally that colour, but a lot of anxiety can come with it when there's things like that. You unexpectedly get something like a piece of pasta that's a different colour, and you freak out because you don't know if it has food dyes in or not, and you're scared of having a reaction. Now, a kind of obvious struggle of having a food dye sensitivity is if you eat food dyes and react to them. Thankfully, I have not eaten food dyes since I was 15 years old. I haven't reacted to them since I was 15 years old, so I'm very lucky. But some people are more risk takers, and they may go out with friends, eat foods, and then have a reaction not realising that they've eaten something with food dyes in. That can be terrifying because then you have horrible symptoms that are triggered by it. Now, it affects everyone differently. As I said, for me it's rage attacks, crying and panic, and well, sometimes it's a little bit different, but those are the main things. But for some people it can be hyperactivity, it can be a worsening of tics if they have a tic disorder, it could be typical allergic reactions as well as neurological and psychiatric reactions. Some people do just have typical allergic reactions from it. Wow. So people may get hives and asthma attacks from it and things like that. Another challenge of having a food dye sensitivity is that sometimes if you ask for someone to meet your dietary needs, they might treat you like a bit of an inconvenience or a bit of a waste of their time, which is a bit of a problem. But I used to attend a kids club, which was a holiday club, and they of course had to feed us. So once they served crackers and cheese, but the crackers and cheese I knew from experience that they usually have food dyes in, ones that I can't have, so I said that to them, and they were very, very annoyed that they had to go and make something else for me. So yeah, that can be an issue as well. But that, again, that's the same with any food sensitivity. But with food dye sensitivity as well, it's something that some people think is quite silly, like how do you react to food dyes? It's such a small thing. Or how does a food dye affect your brain? How ridiculous. But it's not ridiculous. As I said, studies prove it, and there are so many people reporting it. It's real, it needs to be taken seriously. A challenge that parents have is sometimes convincing their child to not eat food dyes, or trying to ensure that their child doesn't eat food dyes. It can be a struggle. When I was younger, I was a little bit of a rebel, and although I knew I had a food dye sensitivity, I didn't really care. And I would go out to the shops and eat sweets and have rage attacks afterwards because it would trigger that. So I was a bit of a rebel, and I wasn't following my dietary restrictions back then. And I paid the price. It triggered rage attacks, which were absolutely horrible. But yeah, a struggle for parents can be convincing their kids to not eat the food dyes, because the parents are just trying to protect their kids and are trying to do what's best for them. But when you're a kid, you don't want to follow that sort of stuff. You're going to eat the food dyes anyway because you don't really care back then. You don't necessarily listen to what they say. But thankfully, by the age of 12, I started taking my food dye sensitivity a lot more seriously, and now since the age of 15, I have not had a reaction. The thing is as well, my reactions, I'm very, very sensitive. So when I had a medication with food dyes in, like a tiny, tiny pill, it triggered a horrific reaction. I have a video called My Week on Food Dye, which I talk about that in. And when I was 15, the last time that I had something that I reacted to, it was the tiniest bit of batter that I had, and it triggered a reaction. And at that time, the reaction was mainly an exacerbation in my tics and a quick feeling of panic. Thankfully, it wasn't too major, but you could still see that there was a reaction from it. So yeah, it's a very serious thing, because the tiniest bit of food dye can trigger such a bad reaction. I hope this video was informative, and I hope that if there is anyone out there with a food dye sensitivity, they feel a little bit more understood and like they're not alone. Down below in the description, I will link some information on food dye sensitivity that may be helpful. Thanks for watching. Bye!